Orchids. They can be a ton of fun to grow, but if you don't really know what you're doing, or if you're a beginner at growing orchids or plants in general, then they can really be a pain. So if you're a beginner orchid grower, stick around, because in today's video, I'm going to be giving you 3 tips that you can implement to grow a greener thumb when it comes to orchids. Let's get started. A lot of new orchid growers don't realize that orchids don't grow in soil. They actually grow in sphagnum moss or bark. This is because in their natural habitat, orchids will grow on trees. When plants have this behavior, they are called epiphytes. And orchids are epiphytes. Their roots cling to the bark of trees and absorb all the water that streams down the tree trunk when it rains. This is why it's important to pot orchids in a much more airy substrate such as moss or bark chips. Soil is much too dense, holds water very tightly, and doesn't allow a lot of air to pass through it. So to recreate its natural living experience as much as we can, orchid growers use bark or sphagnum moss. Usually you can get it in bulk and it'll last you a while. Tip 2, and this is a very important one, repot your orchids. But that's not all I'm gonna say, there's more to it. You have to repot your orchids every 6 months or more sometimes. This is because orchid roots are very moist on the inside. This means if one starts to die, then it'll create mold, and that mold will spread to the other healthy roots, leading the other healthy roots to start to die. This is called root rot, and a good way to treat it is to repot your orchid. When repotting your orchid, if you see roots that look like this or this, cut them off. However, if you see any roots that look like this, or this, leave them. Those are healthy roots. You can also tell if you need to cut roots off by the feel. If they feel very plump, then you can leave them. However, if you touch them and the outer layer of the root starts to fall off and it's very papery and decayed, then make sure to take that root off. And repotting frequently will make sure that you don't allow those roots to develop mold and that you don't allow that mold to spread. I like to do a half and half mixture, which means 50% of orchid bark and another 50% of sphagnum moss. If your orchid doesn't have many roots, I suggest doing full sphagnum moss. And then just for it to have some nice looks, you can top it with a little bit of bark chips. Also, something to keep in mind is that sphagnum moss holds water much better than bark chips. However, bark chips allow much more air through than sphagnum moss. This is why I like to do a half and half, because they complement each other and it's healthier for the plant. Tip number 3, and the last tip, is do not water your orchids with ice cubes. A lot of orchid suppliers and websites say that ice cubes are the best for watering orchids because they're slow release. It allows every drop of water to be sipped up by the orchid. However, in reality, the temperature of the water when it melts from the ice and the temperature of the ice itself is so cold that it burns the orchid's roots. This is especially bad if the ice is sitting right on an orchid root. In some cases, you can tell if the ice has burned the root just because of the way it looks. So from my experience, and from the experience of lots of other orchid growers on YouTube, it's recommended that you use room temperature water. So room temperature to slightly lukewarm water is just fine for your orchids. And when watering, what I like to do is bring my orchid over the sink, and I let the water really run through the whole entire pot until I see it gushing out the bottom. This way I know that every root has had a good drink. You can either water when you notice the moss looks dry, or you can water every week. That's what I like to do. Also, a little bonus tip is that if you are using softened water, that is okay. However, because it is softened, it tricks the orchid into thinking that it's had its fill, even though it may be in a critical state. So what I'm trying to say is that even if your orchid looks like it's doing well and the leaves look plump, however you notice that the substrate is dry, make sure to give it a good watering, because the orchid is fooling itself, and it might be fooling you too. So those were the 3, in my opinion, most important tips to beginner orchid growers. I hope this helped you out, and if it did, please let me know in the comments. I love to hear positivity spreading throughout my channel. And although I limited it to 3 tips in this video, if you think there's another tip that's important for beginner orchid growers, leave it down in the comments below. This way they can see it as well. I hope everyone has an excellent rest of their day, and happy growing!